Mm. Good evening, everyone. We're just waiting for everybody to come through. Apologies, we're a little bit late tonight. We've just had a few little technical issues, and we're blaming the storms in Melbourne for that. So we're just a wait for a few more people to come through with us.
Ah, can you hear me?
We
Yeah.
can hear you, Molly.
Oh,
We've just opened, Molly, and we're just letting everybody through. We've got quite a few people coming in now,
I'm
which
so
is
sorry about
great. No, not a problem. We're blaming the storms, Molly. All right, so we're going to get started, everybody. So we would love to welcome you all to Transplant Talk Live, Arrow Foundation's webinar series. So these webinars are an opportunity for us to delve deeper into a number of BMT, stem cell and CAR T related topics. With tonight's topic, starting off with a very popular topic on clinical trials. So I'm Angela, I'm the Patient Liaison Officer at Arrow, and I'm joining you from the traditional lands of the Wadawurrung people near the Geelong region of Victoria. And I have with me today our wonderful host, Yvonne Panic-Hudson. Amongst many things, she's a clinical nurse practitioner in haematology at the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre and at the Royal Melbourne Hospital. And she's also the co-host of the fabulous and very informative podcast, The Straight and Marrow. Yvonne is one of the directors on the Arrow board, and she's joining us today from the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people in Naarm, Melbourne. And I'd also love to introduce to you both, to you all, two of our wonderful panelists who are joining us tonight. We have Molly Robertson. She's a nurse practitioner specialising in lymphoma clinical trials from the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre. And we have George Kiossoglou, a BMT survivor of over 10 years and a patient advocate and clinical trials collaborator, both of whom are also joining us from the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people in Naarm, Melbourne. So I'm going to shortly hand over to Yvonne, who will be facilitating our Q&A, which we hold on completion of both Molly and George's presentations. So please, if you do have any questions along the way, feel free to pop them in the Q&A section. You are also welcome to use the chat section. We'll be monitoring both as we go along. It will be monitored and the questions will be answered at the end. So please do remember that whilst we're here to offer a great webinar tonight, we cannot answer any medical questions relating to your own diagnosis. And we do ask you that you please refer to your own treating teams for that. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Yvonne, who is going to introduce you further to our wonderful panelists. Thank you, Yvonne.
Thanks, Ange, for that introduction. There is just a quick chat message from Rowena saying she can't hear us. It might be your end, Rowena, unless there is someone else in the audience who can't hear us. We haven't had any other messages in the chat. Oh, she can now. Great. That's really, really good news because you're not going to want to miss this. Fantastic. Yeah, we've had a few technical things this evening, but we're ready to go. So as Ange said, I'm Yvonne Panic-Hudson. I co-host the webinar with Ange, and I'm really proud to do that. I'm really delighted that we're kicking off this 2026 series with presentations on clinical trials, which for people who are offered clinical trials can be both an exciting landscape and a murky landscape to navigate. And we've got two wonderful people that can help enlighten you about the trial space. George, who has a lived experience, but also participates, as Ange said, on many committees and groups, ethics committees, and is an advocate and represents consumers in this space around clinical trials. And Molly is a nurse practitioner in clinical trials. She is the first nurse practitioner in clinical trials in Australia. It is a very, it's a novel role, it's exciting, and it's exactly the right space for nurse practitioners to work in. So I am going to hand over to, now Molly, are you right to go? Because you're going to present first, aren't you?
Yes,
Right to go?
I am. I will share my screen now.
So handing over to you, Molly. Thanks very much.
No worries, thank you. Let me just, sorry everyone, I had a bit of technical difficulty as I came on, but I think we are all sorted now. I will just have to quickly look over here to my left. I apologize. I was having, as I said, my computer wasn't working, but here we go. Just checking everyone can see. Yeah, everyone can see. Good. All right. So yes, good evening, everyone. I'm Molly Robertson, and thank you for joining us today. And thank you to Angela and Yvonne for inviting me to speak. As mentioned, I'm a nurse practitioner working in lymphoma clinical trials and CAR-T trials at Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre in Melbourne, Victoria. So today I'll be talking about clinical trials in bone marrow transplant practice, how transplant trials are developed, and how emerging therapies are reshaping the field. I'll also be briefly touching on CAR-T cell therapy, not to go into the technical detail, but to highlight how its entire journey from access to approval is built on clinical trials and why that matters, particularly in the Australian context. So we know that bone marrow transplantation remains one of the most powerful curative therapies in haematology, but it is also one of the most complex and high-risk treatments we deliver. Because of that complexity, progress in this space, including CAR-T, has always depended on rigorous clinical trials. Trials aren't just about testing a product. They're the gateway to innovation. They allow us to evaluate these therapies in real-world settings and understand how they behave in our patient populations and build the evidence base that makes them safe and sustainable. I'll obviously move through this as we've done acknowledgement to country already. Here are my disclosures, and the views expressed today are my own and reflect current evidence and clinical practice. So bone marrow transplantation is one of the most complex therapies in medicine, and every major improvement in transplant outcomes has been driven by clinical trials. The foundations of modern transplantation were laid in the 1950s and 1960s, largely through the work of E. Donald Thomas, who is widely recognized and regarded as the father of bone marrow transplantation. His early attempts at transplantation were bold and experimental, and associated with extremely high mortality. At that time, there was very limited understanding of immune compatibility, infection risk, or graft versus host disease. Graft failure and severe immune-mediated complications were common, and many early transplants were unsuccessful. However, these early experiments were critical. They generated the observations and questions that shaped future research. Through carefully conducted clinical trials over subsequent decades, the field began to evolve. We learned how to perform HLA matching, which dramatically improved donor selection and engraftment. Trials helped define conditioning regimes that balance disease control with tolerability, toxicity, and immunosuppressive strategies were introduced to help reduce the incidence and severity of graft versus host disease. Each of these advancements were incremental, but together they transformed transplantation from an experimental intervention into standardized and increasingly safe clinical therapy. Later, further trials demonstrated that reduced intensity conditioning could extend transplant eligibility to older patients and those with significant comorbidities. Again, fundamentally changing who could benefit from transplant and how it was delivered. So the key message is this: what we now consider standard transplant care was once experimental. It only became standard because clinical trials demonstrated benefit, refined risk, and improved patient outcomes. But if we look at how far transplantation has come through clinical trials, the next question becomes, what are we still trying to improve? Because transplantation is now an established and effective therapy, success is no longer defined by survival alone. Relapse remains a major challenge, but we are also working to reduce treatment-related mortality, particularly in the early post-transplant period, where complications such as infection, organ toxicity, and acute graft-versus-host disease continues to drive morbidity and mortality. Graft-versus-host disease remains one of the most significant barriers to long-term recovery. Even when patients achieve disease remission, chronic graft-versus-host disease can result in prolonged immunosuppression, recurrent infections, functional impairment, and reduced quality of life, sometimes for years after transplant. Increasingly, we are also focused on survivorship. This includes long-term complications such as cardiopulmonary toxicity, endocrine dysfunction, secondary malignancies, and the cumulative burden of ongoing medical care. For many patients, the goal is not just to survive transplant, but to return to meaningful daily life, and that is independence, well-being, family, friends, and work. Transplant, therefore, represents a constant balance between cure and harm. Clinical trials help us to refine that balance. For example, by identifying less toxic conditioning regimes, improving graft-versus-host disease prevention strategies, and introducing earlier interventions to help prevent relapse, rather than simply escalating intensity in pursuit of disease control. The shift we are seeing is towards smarter, more individualized transplant care, where success is measured not only by survival curves, but how patients live after transplant. So BMT clinical trials usually begin with advances in basic and translational science. Much of transplant research is grounded in immunology, particularly T-cell biology, immune tolerance, graft versus leukemia effects, and immune recovery following transplant. These discoveries generate hypotheses that are first explored in preclinical models. From there, strategies move into phase 1 clinical trials, which in transplantation are fundamentally about safety. Unlike many oncology phase 1 trials, transplant patients already face significant baseline risk. They are immunocompromised and often heavily pretreated and exposed to multiple concurrent toxicities. For this reason, phase 1 bone marrow trials are extremely cautious, with conservative dose escalation, strict stopping rules, and intensive toxicity monitoring. There's really lots of rules. The aim of a phase 1 is not efficacy, but really it is to establish that an intervention can be delivered safely without unacceptably increasing treatment-related adverse events or toxicity. Once safety is established, strategies move into phase 2 trials. Phase 2 bone marrow transplant trials aim to detect early signs of efficacy while continuing to closely monitor safety. These studies often focus on the outcomes such as relapse rates, engraftment kinetics, immune recovery, or the incidence and severity of graft versus host disease. Because we can't wait years for survival data, phase 2 often use earlier endpoints of a trial to decide whether a strategy should move forward. This is also the phase where feasibility starts to become clearer, not just whether something works biologically, but whether it can be realistically delivered in a busy transplant service. Finally, strategies move into phase 3 trials, where they are compared against established standards of care. Really what we're doing is we're asking the question, is this therapy better than what we currently have? These trials are usually multi-center and often international, generating global data, with Australia playing a key role in the international trial landscape. They must also account for competing risks such as relapse and non-relapse mortality, as well as variation in donor type, conditioning intensity, and supportive care practices. Across all phases, we continue to collect the safety profile of treatment, and long-term follow-up is essential as late relapse chronic graft versus host disease, secondary malignancies, and organ toxicity may not emerge until years after the transplant. All trial phases require intense multidisciplinary oversight. From medical to nursing staff, pharmacists, and trial coordinators play a critical role in toxicity management, protocol adherence, early identification of complication, and long-term follow-up effects. So clinical trials in bone marrow transplantation are not focused on a single intervention. Instead, they span the entire transplant journey, addressing different clinical questions at each stage of care. So some trials focus on conditioning strategies, aiming to balance disease control with toxicity by comparing myeloablative, reduce-intensive, or novel conditioning approaches. These studies are particularly important as we seek to extend transplant eligibility while reducing treatment-related adverse events, especially in the early post-transplant periods. Other trials examine donor and graft selection, including donor matching, stem cell source, and haploidentical approaches. These trials help define how we optimize engraftment while minimizing long-term complications such as chronic graft-versus-host disease. A major area of research, as mentioned, is graft-versus-host disease, prevention and treatment. Clinical trials in this space evaluate pharmacologic and immune-based strategies designed to reduce steroid exposure, promote immune tolerance, and preserve graft versus leukemic effects. Increasingly, transplant trials are also exploring targeted immune and novel strategies, such as post-transplant maintenance, immune checkpoint modulation, cytokine pathway inhibition, and approaches to support immune recovery after transplant. Cellular therapies, which is a huge topic at the moment, trials form another important part of the transplant trial landscape. These include donor lymphocyte infusions and engineered immune cell approaches, most commonly studied in the setting of post-transplant relapse or minimal residual disease. Finally, supportive care trials play a critical role in improving transplant outcomes. Studies focused on infection prevention, viral surveillance, transfusion practices, and critical care have significantly reduced transplant-related mortality and improved overall survival. Many of the improvements we now take for granted, such as routine viral monitoring or antifungal prophylaxis, came from these supportive care trials. So together, these trial types reflect the complexity of transplantation. While they describe how transplant trials are structured, it is the emerging therapies within these frameworks that are now driving the most rapid change in clinical practice. We are currently in one of the most transformative periods in bone marrow transplantation, driven by rapid advances in cellular and immunotherapy, immune-based therapies. A major area of progress is the development of next-generation cellular therapies. CAR T-cell therapy, initially developed as an alternative to transplant for patients with relapse or refractory disease, is now increasingly being studied earlier in the treatment pathway. And this is including before transplant as a bridging strategy, as consolidation, or as a means of deepening remission prior to conditioning. In practice, we are already seeing this in our lymphoma patients, where CAR T may be used to stabilize or improve disease control before proceeding to an allo transplant. These trials are helping redefine how cellular therapy and transplantation can work together rather than compete. Alongside this, CAR-NK and other off-the-shelf cellular products are emerging as promising options. These therapies may offer faster availability, more predictable toxicity profiles, and potentially lower risks of graft versus host disease, making them particularly attractive in the transplant setting. Another rapidly expanding area is the use of bispecific antibodies. These agents are being explored, again, as bridging therapies or as alternatives for patients who may not proceed to transplant, and as strategies for managing post-transplant relapse. We are also seeing innovation in targeted and immune-modulating conditioning approaches, with a focus on developing less toxic, more personalized regimes that reduce organ damage while maintaining disease control. An additional emerging area is microbiome manipulation, with growing evidence that gut health plays an important role in immune recovery and graft versus host disease outcomes. And finally, there is increasing focus on post-transplant release prevention, including maintenance immunotherapy and MRD-guided treatment strategies designed to intervene early and improve long-term disease control. Taken together, these advances reflect a clear shift away from a one-size-fits-all transplant care and towards precision immune-guided therapy with transplantation positioned within a broader and evolving immunotherapy landscape. So while transplantation remains central to our practice, clinical trials have also driven major advances beyond transplant, with CAR T-cell therapy being a key example. So CAR T-cell therapy has completely changed the trajectory for patients with relapse or refractory lymphoma, myeloma, mantle cell lymphoma, and acute lymphoblastic leukemia. These are patients who only a few years ago had very few treatment options left once standard therapy failed. Now, through clinical trials, they have access to therapies capable of achieving durable responses and, in some cases, long-term remission. But is it important to recognise that our access to CAR T in Australia is built entirely again on clinical trials, reflecting the same trial-driven evolution that shaped modern bone marrow transplantation? Without the data generated through these studies on safety, feasibility, and long-term outcomes, there's no pathway to regulatory approval, PBS listing, or integration into our standard of care. And so from an Australian perspective, participation in global CAR T trials has been vital. It's given our patients early access to the next generation products while positioning centres like Peter Mac and other cellular therapy and transplantation centres as active contributors to international data, safety frameworks, and treatment standards. Every patient enrolled is important. Their outcomes shape future trial design, guide toxicity management, and inform how we safely deliver these therapies at scale. And looking ahead, the field is expanding beyond haematology. We're now going into early phase studies and expanding CAR T therapy into solid tumours and even autoimmune diseases. What began as a highly specialised treatment for a narrow group of blood cancers is quickly evolving into a broader therapeutic platform, one that will continue to redefine what's possible in oncology, haematology, and immunology over the coming decade. So as we look to the future of haematology, it is clear that both bone marrow transplantation and cellular therapies will continue to evolve. These will likely be more precise, more personalised, and more integrated with immunotherapy than ever before. Every patient treated on a clinical trial contributes data that directly informs how we manage the next patient. And importantly, we acknowledge and thank our patients who trust us enough to take part in clinical trials as often very vulnerable points in their care. Their contribution underpins every advance we've discussed today. So to conclude, bone marrow transplantation is one of the most trial-driven fields in modern medicine. Its complexity demands rigorous, collaborative, and carefully designed clinical trials, and every advance we rely on today exists because of that evidence. CAR T-cell therapy is a powerful example of this. For patients with relapse or refractory lymphoma, myeloma, mantle cell lymphoma, and acute lymphoblastic leukemia, CAR T has fundamentally changed what is possible. And in Australia, our access to these therapies have been built entirely through clinical trials. But even with bone marrow transplantation and CAR T-cell therapy representing some of our most effective treatments, the work does not stop there. We continue to look for ways to make these therapies safer, more accessible, more durable, and better tailored to individual patients. That commitment to continual improvement, refining conditioning, reducing toxicity, preventing relapse, and improving long-term outcomes is what drives the next generation of trials in both transplant and cellular therapy. And just as with bone marrow transplant and CAR T, the next major advancement in haematology will begin with clinical trials. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions after George's presentation.
Thanks, Molly. That was terrific. I will, obviously people can please feel free to put your questions into the chat or wait until the end. And I'm going to invite George to share his screen and give his presentation. Thanks, George.
Thank you, Ella. And thank you to Yvonne and Angela for inviting me to talk today. And thanks, Molly. I really enjoyed that presentation. So thank you. Well, I actually don't have to do one because you've done most of mine anyway. the way I want to do this time is this is really from a layperson's perspective, but it's really about, first of all, my journey and then other areas that are really important, including the ethical considerations in clinical trials, and also why people go into clinical trials, why they don't, and some of the barriers as well. So let me just go to the next one. Everyone, you can see that?
Yes, perfect.
Good.
Thank you.
So a little bit about me to start with, because I always like doing this. And it was mid-March 2013, so coming up to 13 years ago, that I started feeling unwell, flu-like symptoms, and they didn't go away. 3rd of April, I was officially diagnosed with AML. And that was the start of my journey, and a shock, as it is for most of you that have been diagnosed with a blood cancer. I was immediately sent to St Vincent's in Melbourne, where I was scheduled to do 3 rounds of chemo. The first round was horrible. The second round was good. But after the first round of chemo, I ended up in remission, which was a really good thing, hence why probably the toxicity was so bad. And that meant I didn't need round 3. But I was told that I needed an allogeneic stem cell transplant if I was going to survive long term or have a chance of surviving long term. My siblings then got tested and they all agreed to get tested. And my brother was a 99% HLA match, which, as you will hear from me all the time, I'm very lucky. I really consider myself extremely lucky in this whole journey. So 3rd of April or 3rd of July 2013, I had an allogeneic stem cell transplant, which I have to say, and I will, was an anticlimax. And I want to thank all the clinical trials that went beforehand to make it an anticlimax as well. I had visions because I had a friend in Singapore that went through a bone marrow transplant, but his was actually, what's the word I would use, put into his actual bone, a hole drilled and put in that way, so the old-fashioned way. And that's what I kept thinking that I would be getting. But they developed the aspheresis machine, and my brother came in, donated in the morning. In the 7 o'clock that night, I started getting them in me. So I was, yeah, like I said, very thankful, and it feeds into my narrative about why clinical trials are really important. Overall, I've had a few cases of GVHD, skin, liver, mouth, gut, which was definitely the worst from symptoms, and glomerulonephritis, which is, for those you don't know, it's a kidney issue. I had that twice over 2 years. And interestingly enough, with that one, I think I might have been the first person in Melbourne, in RMH, to actually be diagnosed with it as GVHD of the kidney. And the reason for that is I bumped into one of the hematologists who's now in Wellington, and he said to me that he's actually found other people as well. So it's not that common. Something I always like to tell people, and to me it's really important, is about 18 months post BMT, I developed PTSD and waking up in the middle of the night. And the reason I wanted to mention that is it's important to talk about it. It's important to talk about it with someone so that it's less invasive. And I'm sure a lot of people get it. The other important thing is that I retired from work, which was 41 years in IT, 3 years post BMT. And I was really fortunate that I could do it because a lot of people don't have that option. And I'm in relatively good health and active now, which again, I'm very thankful for. I do a lot of consumer work around Parkville Precinct. And for those of you that aren't aware, consumers are people with lived experience, carers, or people that have a general interest in scientific and medical research. I work with researchers, healthcare staff, including clinicians, allied health, and nurses, amongst other people. And what I will say is I've deliberately done this, but I actually work with people from bench to bedside. So I see basic science research all the way through to how it's implemented in the clinic. I'm also, and most importantly for this, I'm on the Royal Melbourne Hospital Ethics Committee as a layperson and have been doing that for 6 years. And why do I do all this? Because I was lying in bed one day in the hospital with a lot of time on my hand, as most of you may appreciate. And it suddenly came to me that I'm here because of all the research that happened at this point. I had a cousin that had AML when she was 45. She lived till she was 60, but I never recall seeing her look any good. Like she was constantly looking unwell. And I realized what I went through was tough, but it was a lot better than what she went through. And again, because of clinical trials. Okay, so this is going on from Molly's, and it's breaking it down a little further because this is what we actually see in ethics a lot. So when people think of clinical trials, they instantly think of drug trials normally when I speak to people. But there's two different types of those trials. One is a drug trial led by pharma, which are really important. But there's also the investigator-led trials that we're starting to see more of, which tend to be led out of Australia and not by pharmaceuticals, but by actual researchers. And they may look at things like and I'll give you an example called the Victory trial of whether if we give preconditioning of a drug called venetoclax prior to an allogeneic stem cell transplant, will the results be better and less toxicity? Can we actually reduce the amount of conditioning chemo? And do we get less GVHD? So I think they are really important trials, and it's nice to see more of them coming. The other ones that are really important are registry trials, and we're seeing more and more of those. And registry trials are ones where you look at a collection of data that people have collected from medical records, from other clinical trials, and then it can actually come up with some assumptions and some, how can I put it, some way forward without having to go into an actual clinical trial. It's cheaper. It can be almost effective, but at some point we will still need to go into clinical trials. Biobanking is extremely important. And the interesting thing with that is it doesn't really cost you much because if they're already doing a procedure, they just take a little more of your samples. They store it for future use and future research, which is interesting. Observational ones are ones we're seeing a lot more of now, where researchers will sit down in a room, observe what's going on, come up with some suggestions of improvement in day-to-day work or the day-to-day process. Surveys, we're seeing a lot of surveys coming out now of how people feel after they've done trials, before they've done trials. There's a whole range of different surveys, especially around work practices. And most recently, we're starting to see a lot more artificial intelligence trials using data. Okay, why are they important? Well, Molly's mentioned a lot of the reasons. It's really how we improve our understanding how diseases work, how we can improve the treatment outcomes for people, less invasive, better outcomes. In other words, better quality of life moving forward, not just for you, but for your carer, your family, your friends, everyone that's around you. Better screening, which it feeds into the personalized treatment. And also, this is obvious, but it's how we move forward. And what I just want to say there, I always remember this for some reason, but when I was in primary school, which is going back over 50 years, I remember seeing an article, we were shown it on the TV, about leukemia and bone marrow transplants, and they measured the survival in hours and days. And now it's not uncommon for people to be living over 10 years post-transplant. And that is a really big thing. And I think that friend I told you about in Singapore, he's post 40 years, which is absolutely phenomenal. Okay, now some of the issues with all of this, the biggest issue, funding. It's always the biggest issue. It always will be. A stat I want to give you is, and this was told to me about 3 years ago, and it's sort of still relevant, which is it will takes about 18 years to go from bench to bedside on average, and about $1 billion in cost to get to that point. And that is why funding is really important. You hear about the ones that are successful, you don't hear about the ones that fail. And one of the other issues is, and this is actually a big one that we see a lot in the ethics, is unable to recruit enough participants. And it is a big issue. And there are various reasons which I'll go into shortly. But we do need more participants in order for the trials to work, to go ahead, to go past phase 1. There is always a concern about potential serious adverse events. The one that I could never get my head around was a potential serious adverse event was death. And that brings it home, but I don't actually think it's an adverse event. I think it's an endpoint. And the time taken to initiate, this isn't just government, it goes from funding from the research, getting it through to a pharma company being interested in doing a trial and so on. And that comes down to the cost of all of it again. The benefits. For drug investigator trials, one of the things that we would like to, that we encourage people for in this is access to cutting edge technology that you may not get under standard of care. And I think that's really important to emphasize. The other one that we emphasize is I'm going to say this, I had really good treatment throughout my whole experience, and I still do. But if you're on a clinical trial, you get even closer monitoring and even better treatment. And that's really important. And one of the things I would really like to see is clinical trials become an option for standard of care at some point. And I know there's been discussions on that. And for some people, it may be the last resort. And I will go into 2 people that I know, and I know a lot more that have gone through these clinical trials, but I spoke to one of them who used to be one of my bosses, and he said, I'm on a clinical trial. I'm still around because of it. Unfortunately, he passed away. And the other one was, I'm on a clinical trial because it was the last throw of the dice. That was about 5 or 6 years ago, and he's still active, running around. He's had a new lease of life, which is wonderful. But the other benefit and why people do it a lot is not so much for themselves, but for what they can give to the future generations. And it's that sense of altruism in giving back, helping those that follow you. And it kind of makes you feel good in a way. Now, the reasons people don't, and these are some that we've experienced and surveyed. It's too onerous, it's too many hospital visits, especially true if you're in regional areas, and it takes a big chunk out of your life. And that's the second bit there, too much time away from home or their businesses. And this actually struck me when I was going through my chemo, and there was a lady that was trying to sell her business while she was going through chemo, and she was struggling. There was another person who couldn't wait to get back to their farm because they needed to work. So it's that really, really important thing. And that's why they don't go for clinical trials at times. Another one that surprised me was that their treating clinician sometimes prefers them to be on standard of care, sometimes because they don't feel that the clinical trial will be of great benefit to them, but sometimes it's just being cautious. And people going, I feel better. I don't need it. I'm happy with what I've got. And the last one, which is always a debatable point, and it's a very individual thing, is the amount of potential extra life or time that you will get if you're on a clinical trial, and the quality of the life may not be good enough. So there may be a lot of really bad adverse events, and you just don't think it's worth the risk. On the flip side, and I want to differentiate something here, I mentioned what a consumer is. There is a clinical trial participant. They are not consumers, they are participants. So what we're doing a lot more now is getting people with lived experience to help in the development of clinical trials. And that's from the protocol, from the patient-facing information, and to help improve the process through feedback loops as well. The one that is probably the most important that they get involved in is to help develop the patient information in an understandable and readable format. I'm going to go into that one in a moment, but they're what a lot of consumers do, and there are more and more consumers getting involved in the clinical trial side from the development of it. And what do we look at in ethics? And this may surprise some people, but the ethics committee is made up of a whole lot of people: scientists, lay people, legal people, and others. Some genetic people, some carers, etc. We look at whether it's scientifically sound. Now, clearly, I can't tell if it's scientifically sound, but the scientific people do. Will it produce a better result, potentially a better result of standard of care? If it doesn't, what's the point of doing it? Is it onerous on the participant? And this is something we look at a lot. Are the potential risks worth the potential reward? And we have knocked back trials because we didn't think the risks were worth it. Is it equitable? In other words, and this is where I struggle a little, can someone in the region or someone from a socio-economic demographic have access to this without it being cost prohibitive or onerous on travel, etc.? So we look at things like that as well. Is there an opportunity for people where English is a second language or they come from different cultures? Are they able to access it as well? Are there any conflicts of interest with the researchers versus the pharmaceutical companies? The PICF being readable, again, there's a couple of things here. The worst PICF I have seen was about 47 pages in length, and no one could read it. It was basically a contract. And that unfortunately comes from a US company, and we don't have much say in it. So the comment I will make around PICFs is get your clinician to explain it to you in simple terms, what you're going to go through. If you don't understand anything, ask questions. If you're not sure, keep asking questions until you're sure. Okay? And the other thing is there is actually an NHMRC, which is the governing body type of a lot of this medical research, and they have a national statement on ethical conduct in human research, and we constantly refer to that to make sure that everything, the actual trial fits into that. Does it include vulnerable groups and how are they handled? So there's always this potential power imbalance there. And again, it comes back to you need to remember that in a trial, just because someone says you need it, you don't have to take it. It's optional, and the final decision is yours. And the final one, or couple there, one is the consent process appropriate? And we have various types of consent there. It's verbal, is it on paper, is it electronic? Do you have enough time to review it? And the last bit there, which I feel is really important, is the carer considered in the whole project? Part of the reason for that, and Yvonne's heard this a bit, is I'm still around mainly because of my carer, who is my wife. And finally, I've been involved in registry trials, biobanking, surveys, trials changing standard operating procedures, and I'm currently on 2 trial management committees. One of them is on AML with the bone marrow transplant team, and I want to make a point of that one to show you how powerful your voice can be as well. It started from a conversation with my hematologist around, wouldn't it be nice if there was a way of either not getting GVHD or reducing the ability to it? And that conversation happened in 2017. And this project we went through, eventually got funding through various grants, and it eventually went into phase 1 3 years ago now, I think. And it took a long time to get participants, but we got there, and it's coming to an end shortly. But it's been a very interesting one, and something that I hope the results are really good. We don't know yet, but that the second one is not related directly to bone marrow transplants, but it is indirectly. It's about ICU, and it's about a digital ICU initiative where when you come out of ICU, whether any digital help or tools will actually help you get over the issues that you have when you leave, when you've been out of ICU. And that one is, again, coming to its fruition, and the results are looking positive on that. So there's some of the things. I'm going to leave it at that because I've probably gone over time. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks, George. You absolutely have not gone over time. I think that the audience will agree. We could listen to you for a lot longer. That was fantastic. You really explored some really important issues for patients and carers, but also for healthcare professionals to keep in mind. And you know, the interface between that understanding is super important. I'm going to give you a little bit of a breather. Just to have a drink, and I'm gonna ask Molly to answer a question in the chat. Part of the question is related to medical advice, so I'm sorry we can't answer that. But there is part of the question which is asking about clinical trial availability in CAR T across Australia. So, you know, it was very narrow in the beginning, wasn't it, Molly? But, you know, availability is expanding. So if you could perhaps touch on some of the centres in Australia that have clinical trials for CAR T. Yeah. And the second part of that question is, to Leah, who asked the question, who should she speak to about asking that question? Thanks.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So at the moment, we actually have CAR T centres in most parts of Australia, except, I think it's easier now to say, except for Northern Territory and Tasmania. The Royal Adelaide Hospital has just come on, which is really exciting for all of those patients in South Australia. But every state has at least a CAR T centre, and then of course there are some states such as Victoria, Queensland, New South Wales, they all have multiple ones as well. So yes, it's really nice to see CAR T expansion across Australia, and more accessible for patients, because as you said before, Yvonne, it started off a lot smaller, and people had to travel quite far to get access to this treatment. If anyone wants to know any trial that is open, there's the Australian clinicaltrial.gov.au website, and then there's Australian cancertrials.gov.au. So that's a place that you can find if there are trial options open. I will say it's not always up to date with, as George alluded to, that trials, once they go through ethics, they can take a long time to get to governance and everything like that. So then these websites can take a little bit longer to catch up to those. However, it would be really speaking to your specialist, so your hematologist, and asking the question, when treatment is being presented, do you know if there's any clinical trials available? There might not be in the centre that you are. You might have to be referred to other centres, but I think that's an okay question to ask. Is there a clinical trial available? So yeah.
Thanks, Molly. That was a great answer. George, you've answered, Lisa.
I've done it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
Lovely comment about George being inspirational, and I've known George for a long time, and I agree. And this is a question that you can both perhaps answer together. How should people broach the question of enrolment onto clinical trials? I mean, obviously, sometimes a trial is for a specific purpose. So, for example, graft versus host disease, or enrolment on a study to provide a sample that may or may not be used specifically for that individual. But if someone's offered an option of standard of care, so standard therapy, or a clinical trial, how do they go about navigating that conversation? We talked about trials being exciting and murky. I would imagine that there's a bit of both in that. What are your suggestions from a clinical perspective and a past patient perspective? You can battle over who goes first.
Now, you want me to go first?
Yeah.
Okay. It's kind of what I said before. Find out as much as you can about it. And by that, I mean, how long is it going to take? What are the potential side effects? And that's really, really important to see. But not only what are the potential side effects, because you'll get a list a mile long or pages long. It's really how likely are they to happen? Because when you look at a lot of these things, you can be scared off, and some people are scared off by the number of side effects, but you might only get one or two of them or none. It varies. But also talk to your family about it. But I'll reiterate, read what you can about it. We're getting a new PICF format, which is from an organization called CTIQ, which is going to be wonderful. It'll put it in lay terms. But if you don't, and I'll keep repeating, if you don't understand, keep asking. And if they say something like, it's only, it'll only take you, you'll be in hospital for overnight, but what's that going to look like? Do I need to be isolated? Do I need to be, does my family need to come in from the country? Things like that. But just keep asking those questions, and then you need to work out for yourself whether all of the issues that potentially may occur are worth the extra amount of time you may get. And I think that's a really important thing.
Yeah. Molly? Following on from that, so as George said, write down as many questions you have. Whenever I give a PICF to a patient, I say, write all over it, scribble all over it, highlight it, come back, with all of that in hand, so that when we do have the consent visit and we start to talk about it, there is no question that hasn't been answered. And, George said it in his talk, it's not a legal contract. You can come off a trial at any time as well. Just because you've started, it doesn't mean you can continue with it too. So that I think is really important for patients to know as well. And, you know, whether you go for a trial or there's standard of care treatment, yeah, as George said, continue to talk to family, friends. If you have a GP that you really like, you can talk it through with them as well. You can keep coming back and, you know, obviously depending on how quickly you need to start treatment, but you know, if you're not ready to sign on to the consent yet and you need a little bit more time to think about it, that is okay. But know that that the trials that we do have in hematology or cancer care is that we are trying to improve on what we already have as well. So, you know, hopefully the trial is the you know, better option, but sometimes it's not. But that's the roll of the dice with clinical trials as well. So there is no right answer, but be guided by your primary consultant. If there is a research nurse or a study coordinator, they're always happy to answer questions as well, and then your support around you too.
Thanks very much. I'm going to finish with a question from Kate, who is a clinical trial coordinator. It's a really great one to follow on from the last question. I'm a clinical trial coordinator and find it difficult to explain CAR T therapy simply in a PICF. I would appreciate some insights from either Molly or George on simplifying complex processes like CAR T and BMT treatment.
Yeah, it is difficult, and I actually sat on the Peter Mac ethics board. I'm no longer on it anymore. I gave up my rotation, but you know, as these treatments come along, they are a little bit more complex to explain, and we do want to create consent forms that are in lay terms, but sometimes there are no other, at least that I've found. There'll be a term and I don't know what it is, and we don't know how to convert that into layman's way. But that's also the way that that, you know, what I actually really liked about the ethics board was listening to people not in the medical field, because for us it was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And then it, you know, George would say, no, that doesn't make sense actually at all. So look, I think it's part, yes, they're trying to simplify it as much as possible with providing the same, you know, as simplifying the paper format, but being there to us to be able to answer the questions and explain it to the patient as well. I think it's, you know, a consent is part, yes, that have the person read this and understood, but also it's in conversation with the treating team as well. And the treating team can really help fill in, you know, any gaps that might be, any of those questions as well, I think, and talk it through like that. George, you'll probably have, you know, an idea as, you know, but yeah, it is difficult now with the consent forms and these type of treatments that are coming through. Oh, I should say, sorry, one of the consultants that I work with loves drawing pictures. So I don't know if you're really good at drawing pictures, but that's a nice other way to explain, okay, you know, here's the cell, here's the CAR, you know, here's the malignant cell, and break it down like that as well. I guess it really depends on the individual and how they are taking in the information.
I'm going to cheat. You can actually run it through ChatGPT or Gemini AI and say, give me a lay summary of what CAR T cell therapy is with a diagram. But what I will say is run it past consumers as well, because if you write it, and this, I will say this, some of the best PICFs I have seen are where consumers have actually reviewed them and modified them. And I think that's a really important thing to do. But if you try and do it, it doesn't have to be, well, actually, I'll reverse that. Keep it simple. That's probably the biggest thing, because if you're going through this, you've got a lot on your mind. One of the things I didn't mention is I had to go back and look at what I'd signed to see what I remember, because it was all a blur. So, yeah, I mean, use ChatGPT or Gemini and then run it past some people. Don't just use it verbatim, because they do make up things and there's hallucinations, but just use it as a way of starting to do it. CAR T, in my mind, is actually pretty straightforward. We take out, we take blood out from you, we take your T cells, we engineer them to do something else with them, and we put them back in. It doesn't have to be any more difficult than that. The only thing I would add is the amount of time it takes to do that is always important to mention that, because we do have that time lag, but also the side effects and the potential side effects of that one can happen.
There's also supplementary, Lymphoma Australia, Cancer Council, they often, have it written down as well with pictures too. So as long as it aligns with the product and it's not too indifferent, I think those resources are really great as well.
So in the interest of time, we're going to have to finish up. I will actually I'm going to throw one question to you, George. So there is a question in the chat just asking how people get involved in the research landscape or clinical trials landscape. So this is someone who has had the lived experience of a blood cancer and a bone marrow transplant and a CAR trial prior to BMT. So lots of lived experience. Now, the questions actually presented as how they can give back to the continuing research landscape despite living in a rural area. I would say because they live in a rural area. That's what I would say. That's actually the big thing. George, just really quickly. Yeah.
Look at where you were treated, whichever hospital, and if they have a research arm, they will be more than happy to take you on as a lived experience person, right? If not there, then one of the medical research institutes, they are always looking for lived experience people, especially with blood cancers. Okay, you can look at the Cancer Council, whether it's Victoria, New South Wales, South Australia, all of them, they are always looking for cancer or people with lived experience of cancer. So that's the short answer. Regional is great because we do need regional because they have their own problems. And the best thing that came out of the pandemic was exactly what we're doing now with telehealth and video conferencing and all that. So I'm at one of the places I volunteer at is the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute, or WEHI. We have people from Brisbane, Sunshine Coast, rural Victoria, rural New South Wales, Sydney, all around the place, all because they can do it online now. Okay, so that's no longer an impediment. But and also Merrin, was it Merrin that asked that? Yeah. If you want, I can chat to Merrin separately if you like.
Fantastic. Thanks, George. That's very generous of you. All right. Well, I'm going to thank George and thank Molly. It was a fantastic conversation, and we obviously could go on for a long time. So maybe we need to do a part 2, Ange. We can talk about that. But I'm going to hand over to you. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. Molly and George, that was very good, really informative. And I will say, I was actually just thinking as well, we've done some great webinars on CAR T as well. So if anybody is wanting to have a look at them, you can jump onto our website, and we've got past webinars on there because there was some great explanations of CAR T through some of those webinars as well, just in case you do like the pictures. I was thinking the same when you were saying that, Molly. There was some really great graphics, and it's really good if you're a visual learner, I think, to go through that sort of stuff. But you were both very informative. I got a lot out of it, and I'm absolutely positive that our audience will have too. So thanks so much for joining us. And we got there in the end with our little technical difficulties. But yeah, all good. We really appreciate you all coming along. We appreciate your support, Arrow. Can't be here without the support of all our community. And we do offer several services through emotional support services and financial support. So if you are a patient that's looking towards wanting a little bit more support through your transplant, please reach out to us. You can find us at www.arrow.org.au. You have my email as well from your registration, so you can always reach out to me as well. We do also have a very short survey at the end of this that's completely anonymous, so please feel free to fill that out. We always learn from every answer that comes through, so more than happy for you to stick around and do that for us if you can. But otherwise, we have another webinar coming up in April. Keep your eyes peeled for that one. It's going to be a great one. It's all about exercise and BMT, so pre, during and post, and it's going to be a really great little session. So thank you again for coming along. Thanks to our panelists. You've been amazing, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.